Hello and welcome to more history stuff. Yesterday I made a video about Sir Adam Gurdon, the Outlaw Knight of Hampshire, and I took his career up to the early 1260s, just on the cusp of the Civil War period in England. So this is the second video about Adam Gurdon and his friends and enemies. I don't know how many videos I'm going to make about him. Let's see how long he lasts. So in my last video I remarked that Adam is one of the rebel leaders among the disinherited whose career is very sort of Robin Hoodish. They live as forest outlaws, and many of their deeds, many of their antics are quite similar to the content of the legend of Robin Hood, and I think probably had quite a significant influence on those stories. The legend is, if you like, a sort of fictional echo of real events and people, which isn't quite the same thing as saying that Robin Hood was a real person, just that the story and the circumstances of it are probably inspired by real events, and in all likelihood has its roots in this period, in the period of the disinherited in England in the 1260s. And Adam, just to reinforce his sort of Robin Hood credentials, actually has an evil sheriff for an enemy. This chap, not the Sheriff of Nottingham, he was the Sheriff of Dorset in southwest England, and his name was Elias de Rabane. Now Elias was a Frenchman, one of the very unpopular sort of foreigners, or aliens as they were called, who were brought into England during the reign of Henry III. Loaded down with titles and money at the expense of Englishmen, which causes a lot of bitterness, a lot of discontent. It's one of the issues that lead to the Civil War. And Elias is quite a spectacular bad guy. He would make a very good villain if he was to sort of star in a film or a series of novels. And just to give a few examples, his career is quite detailed, quite well recorded, and it basically reads like one long rap sheet of criminal accusations against him. To give a few examples, in February 1253, his deputy, his under-sheriff, Walter Burgess, was assaulted by enraged locals at Shaftesbury. And this was the first time that any sheriff or sheriff's officer in England had been attacked in Dorset. Dorset are usually a very sort of peaceful, quiet place. An instance like this shows how unpopular Henry III's government was becoming at local level, at regional level. So the local peasantry are clearly very angry. They're actually attacking the sheriff and his officers in public. And Elias also, just to compound his problems, he made powerful enemies in the form of the Earl of Gloucester and local landowners such as one Alfred of Lincoln, who was a cousin of the Baron of Bayeux in Lincolnshire. I'm reading from my notes, obviously, that's when my eyes are down this way, so I'll look up as much as I can. And to give an example of what Elias gets up to, his sort of nefarious deeds, just before he died in 1250, the Baron of Bayeux had been basically intimidated by the king, Henry III, into marrying one of his daughters to Elias, the hated Sheriff of Dorset, and then to settle his entire estate on Elias and his wife, which means that his wife's sister, Joan, because the Baron of Bayeux has got two daughters, is disinherited, completely disinherited. She's then shunted away to a priory in Lincolnshire, Six Hills Priory, just to get her out of the way, shunt her into a religious house. And then 3 years later, Elias actually abducts her. He goes to the priory and he drags her out with the king's knowledge and connivance, and she's spirited away abroad to be forcibly married to a nobleman in France, one of Elias's kinsmen. So this is the sort of thing that this Elias de Rabane character is getting up to. He's extremely unpopular in Dorset. He's oppressing the peasants and the tenantry. He's making enemies among the local landowners. He's behaving in a very sort of high-handed, corrupt way. And you can see why there's so much discontent. And this is happening all over England, but Dorset is just like this sort of the case study for this this particular subject. And Elias is quite aware that he's unpopular. And what he does, instead of changing his behaviour, instead of sort of trying to make friends and moderate his actions a little bit, he starts stockpiling his castle at Corfe, this very impressive royal stronghold, Corfe Castle. From 1252, he starts stockpiling it with crossbows and military equipment and soldiers. So he's creating this sort of impregnable stronghold. So this is another example of how unpopular he is, that he feels it necessary to sort of shut himself up inside this castle, and he'll be safe there, nobody can get at him. So yes, Elias is very unpopular, a proper wicked sheriff, and he basically, along with other sort of unpopular aliens who come into Dorset, they trigger this revolt that is bubbling under throughout the 1250s, and then finally comes to a head in about 1263, 1264, which is when the civil war in England generally sort of erupts all over the kingdom. The tensions have finally reached boiling point. And this is where we return to Adam Gurdon. He puts himself at the head of the rebels in Dorset, and he's ranged against people like Elias de Rebane and other sort of Poitevin French aliens who've come in and behaved in a very sort of tyrannical, corrupt way. And Adam has sort of stood forward and said, no, I'm standing against you. I'm the sort of I'm the figurehead of this local revolt. Quite as I say, you know, more sort of Robin Hood comparisons. Really, he's a sort of local hero. He stands up as a sort of a champion of truth and justice and the American way and all that sort of thing. It's quite it's almost like sort of comic book stuff. But it happens to be true. This all really happens. It all takes place. And this is also shown by the sort of men who join Adam's band. He starts putting a band of followers together. And most of these men are peasants. He has some knights, some local gentry, but the hardcore of his support come from the peasantry of Dorset, which is an interesting example of how the peasantry, the common folk, are actually starting to make their voices heard in England at this time. They're not just the sort of the silent mass anymore who follow about in the wake of the knights and the barons and the kings. And you know, they're this sort of faceless people. You don't know their names, you don't know where they come from. They're just sort of, they're in the background. They're the grunts in the background. And when it comes to a battle, they get slaughtered like rats. All the knights and the lords, you know, they survive. It's all a bit of a game to them. Warfare is sport to medieval aristocrats. They take each other for ransom. It's all very polite and gentlemanly. But the ordinary people are sort of massacred, and nobody cares very much. Well, this is all starting to change in England this time. The peasantry are actually finding their voices, and it can actually, it's a little bit moving actually, because it's quite clear that they're just not going to take it anymore. That they've had enough of being this sort of oppressed bunch of nomarchs who can be kicked around and pushed around, and they're starting to sort of say, no, actually, we've had enough of this and we're going to fight back. They still have a knight for their leader. I mean, Adam Gurdon is by no stretch of the imagination a peasant. He's also a member of the gentry, the landholding classes. But it's interesting that he manages to rally this great sort of horde of local peasants to his banner and turns them into a bit of an army. They're quite well organised, and some of the names and the circumstances and the background of these peasants, they survive. Some of the details survive. So, for instance, we know that some of their names. Got some of them here: Henry, son of the smith; John Broom the potter; Thomas, son of Hugh the cobbler; William the carter. Most of these men didn't have much money, didn't have much in the way of worldly goods. For instance, one of the richest of them, a peasant named William Herbert, he's described as having 12 pence a year, which is an absolute pittance. An income of 12 pence a year. Most soldiers, common infantrymen, or unskilled labourers in this era are paid 2 pence a day, and that's a sort of basic living wage. So somebody who's on 12 pence a year is really at the bottom of the sort of the social heap. He's very poor indeed, and he's actually one of the richer ones. Some of Adam's followers, for instance, Thomas, son of Hugh the cobbler, he's described as having nothing in the world. And this phrase crops up repeatedly to describe these men. They have nothing in the world. They are villeins, they are bondsmen, they're the lowest of the low, the lowest tier of medieval society. And what's interesting about Adam's revolt in Dorset is that there's no suggestion that these men were forced to join him. Usually when the peasantry are raised to join a lord or a baron to go on a military expedition, they're conscripted, they're forced to fight. They're sort of dragged out of their villages, given very basic uniforms and equipment, and packed off to go and fight and die somewhere. They don't have much choice in the matter. This is slightly different. These men appear to have followed Adam because they wanted to, which suggests that his cause was their cause, that they all believed in the same thing. And this impression is further reinforced by the presence of 3 priests in his company. These men would have been used to preach to the people of Dorset. Adam would have sent them out to go and preach the message of reform, of standing up to this sort of local tyranny, of fighting against men like Elias the Rebane, who were entirely corrupt and exploitative and had alienated everybody. These people who came into the county and started behaving like petty tyrants, they managed to unite the whole of Dorset, which is previously quite a quiet, peaceful area. They managed to turn it into this sort of boiling cauldron of hatred and rebellion. And it shows that you can only push people around for so long. Even sort of peasants with nothing in the world, the worm will eventually turn, and this is exactly what happens here. So Adam raises this army of peasants, and one of the first things he does is capture Dunster Castle. Dunster Castle is a very impressive stronghold. I've put a picture up on the front of this video. It's still there, very much still exists, on a remote hilltop in Dorset. And it was a royal castle. It was actually owned by the Queen, Henry III's wife consort, Eleanor of Provence. And Adam and his men, sort of in spring of 1264, they descend upon the place, they capture it, and they turned it into their stronghold. So this royal castle has been turned into a sort of a bandit's fortress. It's now a nest of outlaws and rebels. There's no suggestion that they had to besiege the place or assault it. It's so remote, Dunster, that if there's anyone there at all, there's probably like a steward and a handful of servants. No garrison. And once Adam and his merry men turn up at the gate, whoever's holding the castle probably just puts his hands up and say, yeah, okay, you can have it, that's fine, just let me go. So we're into the spring, summer 1264. Adam's got his army of peasants, he's got his castle. What does he do next? Well, I've spoken for about 14 minutes, which is pretty much long enough for these videos. So you'll have to wait for the next instalment to see what Adam and his merry guys, his merry band, get up to. Okay, hope that was entertaining, and I'll hopefully talk to you again later.